I completed chapter 2 of the structural dissociation book called The Hunt Itself, and I highlighted the passages that I wanted to read from that section. So here we go. Actually, this first one was the very end of chapter 1, but the rest are all chapter 2. Childhood abuse and neglect are major factors in the development of trauma-related disorders in adults following their exposure to extremely stressful events in adulthood. Early traumatization is a major risk factor for more severe symptoms that persist over time. Thus, childhood traumatization plays a central role in the development of trauma-related disorders in children and adults. PTSD, CPTSD, OSDD, DID, etc. Even when the extremely stressful event is in childhood, if you develop PTSD from it, you probably also were traumatized as a child. Okay, on to passages from chapter 2. The patient as ANP, which is the apparently normal part that you spend most of your time in, consciously and unconsciously avoids stimuli related to traumatic memories. For example, ANP is phobic of traumatic memories and related stimuli. This evasion maintains or strengthens amnesia, anesthesia, and emotional constriction. I found that particularly interesting because I have a lot of emotional constriction. This avoidance is not a goal in itself, but assists the survivor as ANP to engage in daily life by excluding what seems too difficult to integrate. However, this mental avoidance also interferes with ANP's ability to organize, coordinate, and engage in the action tendencies that have become core features of EP. So, a point that was kind of made in a previous video, our action systems have a lot to do with what becomes ANP and what becomes EP. And so this is saying that because ANP has to avoid the traumatic content that EP holds, whatever action tendencies are associated with EP can be extremely challenging for ANP. Janae noted that many survivors lose their capacity to assimilate new experiences, as if their personality has definitively stopped at a certain point and cannot enlarge anymore by the addition or assimilation of new elements. Thus, the survivor's capacity to learn from experience and to adapt may be limited to some degree for all parts of the personality. Moving on to another passage. A major challenge for ANP in primary structural dissociation, which is what people with simple PTSD have, is to integrate action tendencies within and across all daily life action systems. This challenge may pertain to the integration of two or more different action tendencies, but it also can contain a single action tendency that belongs to different action systems. For example, running can be part of defense, play, or attachment. When a particular action tendency is associated with traumatic memories, this tendency may be avoided within all action systems because it becomes a reminder of the traumatic experience and can activate EP. So in that running example, if running is seen as a way to defend yourself, maybe you had to physically run away from a threat at some point, you may also lose the ability to enjoy running in play or attachment-based experiences because your system just goes, running equals threat now. ANP's difficulty in regulating emotions includes problems with arousal states. Some survivors as ANP experience chronic numbness, a shutting down of emotional and physical feelings and awareness, particularly in regard to traumatic events and relationships, emotional numbness, and life lived at the surface of consciousness. However, to the extent that a survivor's mental avoidance is not effective and mental efficiency remains insufficient to integrate traumatic memories, he or she experiences chronic hyperarousal. In this case, the survivor may not feel numb, but instead may feel overshadowed by a chronic dysphoria, a sense of urgency about tasks, generalized anxiety, depression, guilt, shame, frustration, irritability, or rage that prevents intimate relational feelings and enjoyment of life. Most often, ANP will vacillate between extremes of hypo and hyper arousal because of the inability to regulate affect. The survivor as EP is rigidly fixated in particular action tendencies that were part of traumatization. In primary structural dissociation, EPs are most often stuck in the various subsystems of the physical defense action system. However, EP may also be mediated by other action systems involved in traumatization, such as sexuality. This is an example that includes SA. Ina, who had PTSD, became sexually aroused during GRAPE when her abuser incessantly stimulated her. As EP, she not only experienced fear and anger, which were affects related to the defensive system, but also engaged in compulsive self-pleasure, I guess. That doesn't feel like a great terminology to use in this case, but you understand what I'm trying to say and what I'm trying to get around here on TikTok, I hope. That behavior is related to the sexuality action system. No matter how much she hated herself for doing it, the compulsive self-pleasure was a re-experiencing of GRAPE for Ina. She repeated the actions of the perpetrator over and over to get rid of the arousal that intruded as part of the traumatic memory. The survivor as EP may be fearful, angry, ashamed, despairing, or disgusted and does not realize the traumatizing event is over. Hence, such parts interpret the actual present in terms of the unintegrated past. EP is unable to adapt to the present without the help of ANP. EPs tend to focus their attention on attachment loss and sources of actual or potential physical threat. Once dissociated, defensive actions such as fight or submission may become repetitive and never come to a conclusion. EP can be stuck in one action system, such as defense, one particular subsystem, such as flight or mode. Unraveling the interrelationships between ANP and EP is an essential part of understanding the theory and treatment of structural dissociation. The central relationship between ANP and EP involves avoidance of realization, primarily realization of traumatic experiences. The central phobia of traumatized individuals is the phobia of traumatic memories. The avoidance strategies of ANP may become extreme, rigid, and unconscious, adding to a constricted lifestyle. Thus, while many survivors as ANP directs conscious awareness to activities and goals of daily life in the action systems of daily life, he or she will also consciously or unconsciously avoid trauma-related stimuli. For example, ANP may avoid relationships that might serve as traumatic reminders and instead focus on work to the point of becoming a workaholic. As Nancy said, I was getting on with my life, and the busier I was, I thought, the better. I was making a new life, one that left behind the woman who had been raped. Some of ANP's avoidance strategies involve behavioral actions such as SH and substance abuse and avoidance of external reminders of traumatic experiences. SH and substance abuse temporarily dampen emotional pain and block traumatic memories. However, these behaviors threaten ANP's need to appear as normal as possible, so that survivors tend to hide or minimize symptoms to belie their distress. Particularly when their own emotions and other internal states are reminders of traumatic memories, survivors as ANP avoid feelings about their relationships and about daily life. They may also lose interest in themselves and thus fail to engage in adequate self-care. ANP may sometimes become fully deactivated with full activation of EP, a phenomenon that results in ANP's amnesia for the episode and is typically called a switch. This term has been limited to severe dissociative disorders, but is clearly observed in some cases of simple PTSD as well. There are ample anecdotes of such experiences in acutely traumatized combat soldiers, for example. More often than a complete switch between ANP and EP taking place, there's a partial intrusion of traumatic memory, so that a survivor does not have amnesia, but rather some degree of awareness of sensations, visual images, or feeling compelled to behave or feel in a certain way. For example, ANP might feel compelled to cower in the corner or might have fight behavior and feelings that may or may not be under voluntary control, but which are often not understood as flashbacks. Some intrusions may involve traumatic nightmares in which EP is fully activated and for which ANP has amnesia afterwards. Sometimes intrusion of EP is even less clear. Then ANP experiences bewildering nonspecific symptoms such as irritability, hyper or hypoarousal, depression, anxiety, rage, sleeplessness, self-destructive urges, and unconscious reenactments of the trauma. ANP may find it very difficult to determine the underlying cause of these symptoms for long periods of time. However, sometimes they can be related eventually to intrusions of EP.